Let me begin by asking you how the ShangriLa Dialogue is run, and what are the top highlights from this year's dialogue?
Well, for those who haven't attended the ShangriLa Dialogue before in person, I think there's a couple of different elements to it. So it's run over the course of 3 days. It starts with a keynote address on the Friday, and then it runs over the course of a weekend. And there's a formal and an informal part of the program. The formal part of the program is run by the IISS, and that includes a keynote address, a special address, plenary sessions in which ministers speak either alone or on panels. And there's also simultaneous special sessions, which are kind of breakout groups where ministers or other heads of defense can speak a little bit more frankly and in a smaller setting and much smaller rooms about very specific issues that are set as topics. Then there's, of course, the informal program, which consists of bilateral meetings between government delegations and many side chats between delegates in hallways, over coffees or breakfasts and lunches and dinners. The highlights, I think, this year, as was the case in previous years, is always going to be U.S.-China participation in the dialogue. We have had consistent participation from the U.S. Secretary of Defense, currently Lloyd Austin, and the Chinese Defense Minister, currently Dong Jin, whether or not they have a bilateral meeting, and of course this year they did. But of course, other important speeches by state leaders from the region and beyond as well. There's a big contingent of European delegates this year in particular. So it's really interesting to see how these different perspectives combine around key issues that concern the region.
Maya, you mentioned there was a large number of European participants. I also heard that the dialogue included a record number of heads of states. What were some of the top participants? And were there any that came as a surprise to you?
You're right to say that there's a record number of heads of state that participated in this year's ShangriLa Dialogue, and that included President Marcos Jr. of the Philippines, who gave the keynote address, President-elect Prabowo from Indonesia, who gave a special address. The Prime Minister of Lithuania spoke on a plenary session, as did the President of Timor-Leste. And of course, on the final plenary session on the Sunday, there was an address by President Zelensky as part of that panel, which was a surprise, I think, to the participants. He had already spoken 2 years ago at the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue, but he did so virtually, considering the circumstances. So it was a very big effort for him to come to the region, this time in person. And I think that really spoke to the perceived need to speak to the region directly and in person, to conduct his own bilateral meetings and follow-on visits after the Shangri-La Dialogue, and to appeal for participation from the region in the, at that point, upcoming Peace Summit in Switzerland, which has already taken place. We, of course, also, aside from heads of state, had 32 ministers participating, 25 chiefs of defense or heads of defense, and in total there were around 50 government delegations and 3 international organizations and thousands of delegates. So if you haven't been there before, it's a pretty busy place over the course of the weekend.
And given the expertise assembled, what were some of the overall themes that came through in the panels and speeches this year?
I think a really important one was issues around deterrence and reassurance, and that, of course, reflects a lot of debates that have featured in analysis over the past year since the 2023 Shangri-La Dialogue. Conversations around U.S.-China relations, I think, continue to dominate, just because, not just it's about two great powers locked into competition, but also because that competition spills over onto so many different areas of regional security and interests across the Indo-Pacific. We saw that reflected in their speeches, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a second, with regards to their competing visions for peace and stability in the region. But in addition to that, it's also noteworthy to look at the other kind of themes that were present. And here I think there were a lot of discussions about what practical solutions to challenges in the region could be beyond looking at just great power rivalry. And this, for example, looks at Coast Guard cooperation and activity in the region, issues around conflict resolution. We have to remember that aside, of course, from the war in Ukraine or the conflict in Gaza, there is the ongoing situation in Myanmar, which was a feature of one of the simultaneous special sessions. There's other issues like the challenges that countries in the region face from climate change or natural disasters and humanitarian assistance needs. In addition to that, I would say the impact of new and emerging technologies on security and defense continues to be a theme that runs throughout most of the dialogues, and this year was no different. But looking at that European participation as well, there was a new theme this year with regards to the war in Ukraine and looking at, from a regional perspective, the ongoing developments in the Israel-Gaza conflict. And here, I think one of the main striking questions that were posed to a number of speakers, including President Zelensky, was the issue around double standards from a regional perspective as to how European actors and the United States look at certain conflicts through different lenses and respond differently.
Maya, you mentioned one of the themes was practical solutions to regional challenges, and this year's dialogue had a panel on Coast Guard cooperation. Was this a new special session, and what were some of the key takeaways from this?
Yeah, it was the first time that we addressed maritime law enforcement and confidence building as a topic of its own in one of the special sessions that was held at this year's ShangriLa Dialogue. And I think that reflects the fact that maritime law enforcement agencies are increasingly playing central geopolitical roles within the region, that these actors are becoming more frequent actors within the region, are more frequently coming into contact with one another, but there's actually very limited development when it comes to confidence building mechanisms between these actors, or indeed between them and their military counterparts. So I think, real contribution here was bringing together some of the key maritime security agency representatives from 4 countries in the region. That included the commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard, the chief of the Maritime Security Agency of Indonesia, the commandant of the Philippine Coast Guard, and the commander of the Vietnam Coast Guard, who spoke during this special session. And I think the main takeaway from this panel isn't that there are just more of these actors present and active in the Asia-Pacific region, but also that some of these actors aren't necessarily equal in terms of their force structure or their roles within their national context. So here in particular, of course, the Chinese Coast Guard, as you yourself have published excellent work on recently, Bonnie, is less of a maritime law enforcement agency and actually part of the bigger picture of Chinese military capability and power projection within the Indo-Pacific region. And there's questions here about how countries can cooperate through like-minded groupings at the maritime law enforcement level, but also, of course, how China might be responding to that, noting that in 2023, China and Russia signed their own Memorandum of Understanding for cooperation in maritime law enforcement.
And I know, Maya, you're working on a piece analyzing the extent and implications of China-Russia maritime cooperation. I'm very much looking forward to your piece when it comes out. Let me now move to how China participated in the ShangriLa Dialogue. How does China typically participate, and how much importance does China attach to its attendance?
Well, this year, first start off by saying that we were delighted to welcome the newly appointed PRC Defense Minister Dong Jun to the ShangriLa Dialogue this year. It's his first to participate and speak to this audience. He led the largest delegation from across the PLA and Chinese military institutions that I've certainly seen in recent years. But I think the value for China is probably the same as it is for others. It's the opportunity to speak to a wide audience, to convey China's perspective on key issues, and to engage with other delegations through side meetings and bilateral meetings as well. I think the important opportunity here specifically is to speak to an audience at the same level from their perspective as the United States. Most plenary sessions are held in panel formats. Only the United States and China are the only 2 countries who have a plenary session all to themselves. The United States traditionally speaks first through a speech by the Secretary of Defense on the Saturday morning, and on this Sunday morning, the program kicks off with a speech by the Chinese Defense Minister. Speaking on the Sunday, I think, provides the PRC with an opportunity to respond to some of the messages sent in the speech by the U.S. Secretary of Defense in the preceding day, if they so choose. And then there's, of course, a large number of bilateral meetings that the PRC delegation usually holds, as well as, of course, the opportunity to engage at any and all opportunities, which we saw quite a lot of this year, whether that be through participation from the audience, asking questions or making comments during special sessions, or from the floor during plenary sessions, taking the opportunity to ask questions to other ministers, and, of course, many press conferences. And we certainly saw quite a lot of that this year as well.
You mentioned that this was the largest Chinese delegation that you have seen for quite some time. Is it a largely active duty PLA delegation?
I think it's mainly active duty delegation, but there is some participation from retired officers and academics. And of course, in addition to Minister Dong Jun's speech on the plenary session on the Sunday, there was, of course, the participation by former ambassador to the United States, Cui Tiankai, on a simultaneous special session looking at deterrence and reassurance. So there's participation at different levels.
Maya, you mentioned that the Chinese delegation was quite active in terms of asking questions and participating during the different special sessions as well as plenary. And a question I had was how much of that was organized in advance and how much of that were Chinese participants actively responding to what was happening on the spot?
It's hard to know, and we don't have an insight into that as organizers, but it was noticeable that the questions asked by government delegates or non-government delegates aligned quite strongly in their perspectives and in their tone. So I would say that this year there was quite a forward-leaning tone in some of the questions from the floor or remarks from the floor, talking about China's perspective of great power competition or the US's attempts to create bloc politics in the region. So in that sense, in terms of the content of the questions, there certainly seemed to be alignment.
You mentioned Chinese Defense Minister Dong Jun's speech was a highlight of the ShangriLa Dialogue. What did you think of his speech, and what did his speech showcase in terms of China's approach to global security or regional security?
Well, I think his speech was quite confidently delivered, and it seemed very well prepared for the minister's first ShangriLa Dialogue. I think he did try to add more meat to the bone of what, for example, the Global Security Initiative actually entails in practice. So there seemed to be a message that China was all in on providing military training courses, engaging in military exercises with countries in the region, and on professional military education collaboration. One note, of course, was the minister made a specific mention of China's ability to offer tailored approaches to partners. So I think there was an attempt to appeal to countries in the region, not just in China's offer, but of course also in alignment, saying that countries in the region are part of one big family, that Asia needs to decide and ensure security for itself and by itself. Those are all pretty regular talking points, I think, that we've seen in the past in terms of tone and content. But I would say that it's quite difficult to sell that sort of positive message in the sense that after every positive contribution that was mentioned, there was a comparison with, in indirect terms, the United States and Western activity in the region or elsewhere that really turned the discussion towards a negative light. There were, unsurprisingly, quite strong words on Taiwan and on current developments in the South China Sea, and that didn't just continue, of course, during Minister Dong's speech, but into the Q&A as well. In the past, you, for example, saw former ministers of defense from China, such as Wei Fenghe, really take on the challenge to answer as many questions as he possibly could within the time allocated to his plenary session. But it was noteworthy that during this ShangriLa Dialogue, the Chinese defense minister only answered 2 questions, one on Taiwan and one on developments in the South China Sea, particularly with regards to the Philippines. I don't think anything that the minister mentioned in those Q&As was noteworthy. I think the impact of delivering very long responses to just 2 questions during a Q&A session was noted by many in the audience. And I think it kind of reflects 2 things. It reflects, on the one hand, 2 very sensitive issues for the PRC that they wanted to convey clear messages about and leave no room for misinterpretation, and to not necessarily draw red lines, but to convey a sense that, certainly with regards to China's views of how the Philippines is responding to issues in the South China Sea around the Second Thomas Shoal, for example. I think the minister mentioned that China's patience is not limitless, that China's patience has limits. So I think that's one element of it. But secondly, I think we have to remember the domestic political angles, of course, when ministers make speeches, and for China, that's no different. Minister Dong Jun, though appointed as the defense minister, still does not have a place on the Central Military Commission of the PLA. He's not a state councillor as of yet. And so I think there are questions around whether he was able to say anything else or able to respond to other questions in the same way as his predecessors perhaps had.
Thank you, Maya. And I think that's very kind of you to note that he answered 2 questions on Taiwan and the Philippines. Some of us sitting in the room when he was speaking thought that he talked about those 2 topics, but didn't actually address any of the specific questions focused on Taiwan or the South China Sea that were posed to him.
I think that's fair. I probably should have said responded to questions.
And you mentioned the implied contrast in Dong's speech between what China was doing and what the West, including the United States, was doing. How did you think of Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austins' session, and how did Austin's speech contrast with that of Admiral Dong's?
Well, I thought what was really striking was that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin only really mentioned China in passing and Taiwan directly once. So it was a very China and Taiwan light speech from my perspective. And perhaps that's a reflection of Washington having noted the calls for conversations to the region and conversations with the region to be focused on more than just China. And that China shouldn't be the first talking point if it is mentioned when discussing regional security in Asia with counterparts. Countries, of course, want to know that the U.S. takes them seriously in their own right and wants to know what engagement can mean to them without it being linked to China. So the focus on partnerships, I think, was very, very clear in Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's messaging. There was perhaps one or two criticisms that I heard float around that the U.S.'s partnership success isn't as great as it was portrayed to be in the speech. But honestly, I think one can't please everyone in a single speech. And for the United States, certainly, I did think it was a noteworthy different approach than was seen in previous years. There can always be squabbles about whether there was too much detail or too little, but by and large, it was noteworthy that this was a speech really directed towards the region.
I also noticed that Secretary Austin did not mention China very much. What I found very interesting was that President Marcos from the Philippines, as well as the defense minister from Australia, both of them were very forward-leaning in mentioning China many times in their speech. What did you think of those two presentations?
I think you're absolutely right. President Marcos Jr.'s keynote address really touched, I think, on the importance of some of the challenges that the Philippines currently perceives. And this is, of course, a moment whereby the Philippines has very much shifted its approach to countering some of the challenges or responding to some of the perceived challenges that it faces from China, whether that be through deepening its relationship with the United States or Japan, or indeed by increasing transparency around some of the very assertive engagement and behavior that it faces from China at sea. For the Australian minister, I think that certainly was the case as well. I did note the quite strong tone here, but it was more than that. I think it wasn't just criticism of the PRC. I think the most important thing that he mentioned was that China, as a great power, has the responsibility to behave in a certain way and also to take criticism, that this is normal and part of being a great power. And I think that call to kind of living up to the status of a great power as one should behave was a very potent message. It wasn't all just criticism. There was, of course, also call for dialogue and engagement, but that one stood out to me in particular. And I would just add one more thing, which is I think it's important that more countries than just the United States air some of these grievances or send some of these messages in a setting like the ShangriLa Dialogue. Otherwise, it can very quickly become a debate about the US and China who are locked in a competition, whereas other countries, of course, have agency and have voices as well and want to voice their own opinions and perspectives.
I know there was a lot of attention to President Marcos' speech, and the Chinese side were quite worried when they found out that he would deliver a keynote. What did you view as the most significant message Marcos was trying to deliver?
I think the key messages from President Marcos' speech were really the need to abide to rule of law and for the international community to uphold international law in the Asia Pacific. He also appealed, interestingly, to the spirit of ASEAN and the need to continue to cooperate within this regional mechanism. I think it's clear that not all ASEAN countries are in agreement with the Philippines' approach to tensions in its own EEZ, and in particular also how they've responded to incidents revolving around the PRC around 2nd Thomas Shoal. But overall, it was quite strong on the importance of territorial sovereignty. I think some coverage of his response to a question from the audience after his keynote speech caught quite a lot of headlines. And this was about whether or not President Marcos would call a red line and view the death of a Filipino national as the result of a confrontation with China as an act of war. I think his response is actually quite cautiously worded. He said that if by a willful act a Filipino, not only a serviceman, but even a Filipino citizen, is killed, then that, he thinks, is very, very close to what the Philippines would define as an act of war, and therefore will respond accordingly. But he said that although if it comes to that type of situation, we would have crossed the Rubicon, quote unquote, he said very cautiously, in my view, that it almost certainly would be a red line. That, in my mind, doesn't necessarily say it will be a red line, but I think, again, he was trying to balance the need to send a strong signal, considering the tensions between the PRC and the Philippines at the moment, particularly at sea, and the need to not draw a red line that he later perhaps could not live up to.
Great, thank you. Now let me transition back to the messages that China was trying to deliver, particularly, as you mentioned, on Taiwan and on the South China Sea. How do you think these Chinese messages were received by other participants of the ShangriLa Dialogue? Did you see any pushback against the Chinese messages, either in subsequent speeches or during the Q&A?
I think with regards to Minister Dong Jun's speech, there were challenges from the floor as to whether his words actually reflected Chinese actions, and that there was a real gap between behavior and stated calls for diplomacy, dialogue, and peace within the region. Some questions on the floor very much sought to ask Minister Dong to elaborate on some of these perceived discrepancies. With regards to the United States, I think there were, again, questions from the floor that discussed potential double standards in how the United States responds to some conflicts over others.
Maya, you mentioned that President Zelensky also appeared in person, and he received a standing ovation from the audience. In his public remarks, he suggested certain countries were working with Russia to prevent participation in Ukraine's peace summit, which you mentioned occurred last weekend. And also during his separate press conference, Zelensky specifically called out China as that certain country that was working with Russia. What did you think of his remarks, and how did China respond to Zelensky's speech and subsequent press briefing?
China didn't respond to President Zelensky's speech and press briefing directly. I noted that most of the delegates from the PRC delegation had left the room during President Zelensky's keynote, and China held a competing press briefing for the exact same time as President Zelensky's address during the final plenary session of the dialogue. Subsequently, there have, of course, been denials from Beijing through various statements with regards to the allegations they claim are made by President Zelensky. Overall, I think Beijing reiterated that it was unlikely at that time to attend the upcoming peace summit in Geneva, as it did not include Russia. I think that was a message that was maintained throughout. And secondly, that China, of course, called for continuous efforts to support dialogue and resolution to the war. But really, I think no deeper discussion about how China itself can play a role in facilitating that moving forward.
Maya, I noticed that President Zelensky was not at the Shangri-La Dialogue last year, but he did make an appearance in 2022. So what prompted him to return this year, and what did you think was the message that he wanted to deliver to the region?
You're right that President Zelensky participated in the dialogue in 2022, but he did so via VTC at that time, which is, of course, understandable considering the situation he was in at that point. But his decision to come to the region, I think, just in the lead up to the peace summit in Geneva, was really a reflection of his perceived need to speak directly to the region with regards to Ukraine's appeal for support and for participation in the peace summit. But I think it goes beyond that. I think some of the messages were ones that were carefully chosen, of course, to align with the topics of discussion in the upcoming peace summit, but ones that are of concern to the region and have been for the past 2 years. Concern about the impact of the war in Ukraine on food security, on energy security. And then lastly, I think the message that was portrayed about the need to bring back kidnapped Ukrainian children that currently still are unaccounted for. Those are humanitarian, of course, questions that should appeal to the region. In addition to speaking at the dialogue and conveying those messages in the plenary session and during the press briefing, there was, of course, I think, an element here as you rightly have said, to call out disruptive behavior that is impeding progress and was impeding progress from Ukraine's perspective in the lead up to the peace summit. And the calling out of China, I think, reflects really a sense of perhaps frustration at the perceived lack of support from Beijing for the peaceful resolution of this conflict. Here, there were others who noted questions or comments around Beijing's continued support of Russia and of Putin specifically, but I don't think we got a greater sense of answers from the PRC delegation with regards to that.
To your point of China's support to Putin, I think it was striking that Xi Jinping had met with Putin, only 2 weeks before the Shangri-La Dialogue.
Absolutely. And of course, on the heels of his trip to Europe as well.
One final question on Zelensky. I noticed during the main session with Zelensky that there were no questions for the panel from a Chinese delegate. In all the other sessions I attended, there was always a question from the Chinese. And I wonder if that relates to what you were talking about in terms of the Chinese had left their room, so they didn't put themselves in a difficult position of appearing to pose a question to President Zelensky and against Ukraine. What are your thoughts?
I mean, it could be. I'm not sure. I thought there was very little time for a Q&A in that session in general, but you're right to say there didn't seem to be a question from the floor from a PRC delegate. The most interesting question that I thought came from the floor was from a Cambodian delegate who asked a question to President Zelensky about potential double standards. And again, that was, as I noted before, a kind of a common theme throughout the dialogue. But it was an important one that I think was posed by a participant from the region to reflect the real range of diversity in viewpoints when it comes to perhaps the differences in priorities for European participants and participants elsewhere in Asia, where ties to the conflict between Israel and Gaza, whether through, religious or cultural or identity ties, play very heavily. And indeed also, of course, with regards to challenges closer to home, such as the situation in Myanmar.
Let me follow up on that. You mentioned that a common theme was the understanding that the United States had double standards when it came to responding or helping countries that are torn by conflict. Could you elaborate a bit more? It seems like what you're saying is that countries in the Indo-Pacific believe that the United States was not giving Myanmar, for example, enough attention, but significantly supporting Israel and Ukraine. Is that the double standard? What exactly are the complaints about double standard?
I think that's right, but I also think it goes to discussions around whether or not international law is applied equally in both situations in Ukraine and with regards to the conflict between Israel and Gaza. Questions around support, levels of military support for one side in each conflict, support for humanitarian efforts being different in each of the cases. So I think here, again, there is a sense that Western powers perhaps only look at certain conflicts when they are in their interest, but not when they aren't.
Perfect, thank you. Now let me transition to looking at what should we take away from the Shangri-La Dialogue and what China may have taken away. Maybe I'll start with the latter question. What do you think overall China learned from the dialogue?
I actually don't think that there were that many real surprises in the dialogue this year in terms of the messaging that was sent by either the PRC or the US. In terms of what China learned from the dialogue, I suppose a couple of things. One, that it's going to be quite difficult to avoid questions of double standards on China as well. And certainly, again, that question about words not matching actions and behavior in the region is one that I don't think is going to go away. The second is that perhaps countries who are seeking to avoid making a choice between the US and China will likely not have been persuaded to make a choice either way following both the defense ministers' speeches in the plenaries. I think those who want to remain non-aligned will likely remain so. And at the same time, I think a key observation really should have been that the region does want to see improved relations between the US and China. This is a consistent message that comes from various corners of the region. And certainly, I think here, the fact that the two ministers had a bilateral meeting between Minister Dongjin and Secretary Austin was positive, even if there weren't concrete results, at least countries in the region will have viewed that meeting being held as a positive signal that as two great powers, they can at least, and at the very least, talk to each other.
What does China's participation in the Shangri-La Dialogue this year showcase about Chinese diplomacy? Are you, for example, seeing the Chinese delegation this year operating in more sophisticated ways than before, or has it been largely the same as prior years?
I think the types of activities we've seen are relatively similar, and I think it speaks to China's appreciation to use an opportunity to speak to an international audience, and particularly in this case, an Asia-Pacific regional audience, to send key messages and ensure that those are heard. But in terms of kind of reflections on what the participation showcased, I think there were really key strong messages here that the PRC wasn't shying away from. And they really weren't shying away from using strong rhetoric either, whether in speeches or in questions or discussions. It's always an interesting question to think about whether from their perspective, these types of messages and using strong rhetoric has the intended impact at the end of the day, and whether it changes kind of hearts and minds in their favor, or whether they actually just don't care about that and they feel the need to double down on their messaging, or whether or not they just actually care less about that these days and feel the need to double down on their messaging when it comes to their core interests, or as Minister Dong this time said about Taiwan, the core of their core interests. Here, a clear key message was on some issues, like on Taiwan, it's China's way or the highway, and there is absolutely no room for compromise whatsoever.
And this strong rhetoric that you pointed out that Chinese Minister Dong used, did you see also similar strong rhetoric from former Chinese Defense Minister Wei Fenghe?
I think we did, but I think at the same time, the challenge here for each of the ministers is to ensure that the message that is received by those in the audience is that there's no compromise on core of core interests or core interests like Taiwan, but then try to send a positive signal to the rest of the region to show that China can be a country that can be engaged with and that can cooperate with others, not just for Chinese interests, but for the region's interests. And I think the challenge still remains the same for the defense ministers to actually achieve that balance. I'm not quite sure that it worked this time. I'm also not quite sure that it worked in previous iterations.
Thank you. Let me close with one final question. I noticed that there were a large number of corporate representatives at the Shangri-La Dialogue. What do you think corporations may have taken away from the dialogue, particularly as they look at either regional dynamics or potentially U.S.-China relations?
I think what they'll probably have taken away is a sense that the region isn't becoming more stable and that it's unlikely to become more stable in the near term. US-China competition doesn't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. The relationship doesn't seem to be improving, even if there are tactical kind of improvements to the relationship through new meetings or bilateral meetings, as we saw at this year's Shangri-La Dialogue. The strategic direction of this competition seems to still be locked in place. But what else I think they will have taken away is that other countries, particularly middle powers in the region, are looking at their own military modernization and capability development plans more seriously as well, going beyond just thinking about the US and China, but thinking about where they need to make investments in defense terms, or how they might seek to form new frameworks for security cooperation in the region that can include, but also importantly exclude sometimes, both the US and China to serve their own national interests and security needs. But in general, I think, Shangri-La Dialogue notwithstanding, there isn't what I see is an increasing engagement by the private sector and by corporates on security questions in the Asia Pacific. And I think that really reflects how concerned companies are with geopolitical risk these days. They are navigating complex and new challenges that fall outside of their traditional business risk intelligence understandings. The challenges that they face are no longer just about regulatory risks or doing due diligence better. It's now very much about the potential for conflict and instability, and from their perspective, a lack of predictability in the international system. So from their perspective, I think there is a real need to learn how to manage what it means to be a private sector company in an era of economic security discussions or supply chain de-risking strategies, or indeed debates around the potential for national industrial policy. So overall, I think there just is a general reflection on the need to think differently about what risk means to a corporate client moving forward.